Hi everyone, I'm Harry Marshall and I'm one of the territory managers here at Turnitin, and we're sponsoring the Schools and Academies show this year. With me today is Earle Abrahamson, and he's a programme leader for sports therapy at the University of East London and Principal Fellow of Advance HE, and he's going to be presenting today on leveraging higher education best practices in the online secondary classroom. So without further ado, we'll hand over to Earle.
Thank you, and thank you, Harry, for those kind words, and welcome all. It's wonderful to be here at the Schools Show and really trying to share with you some of my practices and some of my experiences in helping students move from the secondary school classroom to their future in terms of whether they choose to study further, but more importantly, how they become better in terms of their learning journey. So the next few slides here are really going to focus on what can we be doing now from a secondary school point of view to really engage and aid students so that they better understand what's expected in terms of their learning journey. So we'll move now to the next slide to look at what the content of this presentation includes. I will start by focusing on what feedback is and really looking at the purpose, value, impact, and reach. So for whom is that feedback meant? How do we use it in a way that is for learning? And what do we learn in terms of how we use the feedback and how we enable students to think about the developmental aspects in terms of their learning journey? Then we'll move on and look at what this past year has really taught us. How best do we engage students by using the online world? What could we do to really make sure that students are learning, but more importantly, understanding the importance of learning whilst they're at home? Then we'll move and look at different ways of preparing students for life learning and look at their learning journeys. And finally, a few words about using the platform of Turnitin to really look at the hidden background to it and how we can use the software to enhance learning. So on the next slides, we'll begin with the journey through feedback. So as the cartoon shows, this is quite typical. A lot of students at all levels of learning require a little bit more than a few words in terms of their feedback. So do we understand the nature of feedback? Do we understand how feedback could have a transforming effect? It can take a student from simply improving their work to actually changing the way they think about their learning. So what happens at times, students may invest a lot of effort, but that is not seen or recognized in terms of their learning. And yet they receive a comment that says, this is not good enough, or you haven't met the standards. And a student looks at that and thinks again, what does this mean? They may be too scared to ask, so they put it on the back burner and they stay put. In other words, there's no learning from it. So how do we encourage the staff, the academic staff, to really think about what the nature of that feedback is? What language becomes important in feeding back to a student? And do we really understand the student and how they receive the feedback? So what I argue is that feedback should be developmental. It should not solely look at what is wrong, but really be a learning journey. And we'll look at why that becomes important as we move on to the next slide. So in this next slide, this is a diagram that really focuses on some of the important tenets of how we can improve, but further understand the value of feedback. And the middle blue circle is really the most important aspect that I want to focus on, where feedback helps students become self-automated or regulated learners. So what we're really looking for, if we think about the secondary school experience, we really want to encourage students to be thinkers, to think about their learning, but also to own their learning, to own their life journey, to be forward thinking in terms of where they are now, but more important, where they're aiming to move to. So how can we then mold or reshape or repurpose the feedback to enable our students, our learners, to own their own learning and become self-autonomous in terms of the control within their learning? So as I move my visual focus upwards and we get to the grey bubble, the key questions that are really important to ask is, what is feedback? What is it for? And then more importantly, for whom is that feedback meant? So let's start with that first, which appears at times a rhetorical type question. What is feedback? And feedback may be different things to different people, to staff, to students, to the stakeholders or stake players within the learning cycle. So feedback in its sense may just be a form of words. It may just be, I've received it, but I don't know what it is. How often are students inducted into what feedback is and what feedback is used for? We don't often take a lot of time explaining to students the value, the purpose, and the growth of learning through a feedback cycle. When we compile our feedback, and many staff have told me that they spend a lot of time writing feedback and they feel as though it's landing on deaf ears. Students are not really reading it. Then there's an underlying issue there. Do we really understand how to feedback? What becomes accessible and acceptable to students? Do we understand the student group that we're working with? Do we understand what excites them, what inspires them, and what would be useful and how they receive the feedback that we spend so long writing about? So the key thought I want you to bear in mind here, for whom is that feedback meant? Is it a monologue where the person writing or giving the feedback has spent a lot of time thinking about it, but only they understand what it is they are aiming to achieve? So it's really about thinking about creating a feedback framework that is simple, that students can look at, understand, and use. And those are the important features that I just want you to bear in mind within that grey bubble. As we move down to the green one, so we go in a clockwise pose, feedback, if it's done well, can really help students identify what's expected, look at the standards, what do I need to achieve, and where am I in terms of that map of achievement. It can also signpost what good work is, and a lot of students need help to see the unseen. In other words, students often require a focus in terms of an example of what good work is. So therefore, they can then model their work based on an example of what those standards are. If students are unclear about what's expected, they're almost creating their own standards, which could be miles away from what the expected standards are. So modeling of good work and feedback, which aligns with what good practice is critical for enhancing and improving how students eventually read and then act upon that feedback. And also feedback can help students set realistic goals. It can help them to plan their work and focus on what it is they are needing to do once they respect and value the feedback that they have been given. If we then move on to the yellow bubble there at the bottom, feedback is fundamental to help students advance, but also to understand how they're being assessed, and also to teach them different ways in which they could be assessed on different pieces of work. Typically, we focus on feedback mainly in written format, but more recently, a lot of research is emerging in terms of the value of verbal feedback or video feedback, or having a dialogue between student and staff. One is receiving, one is giving, but there's a partnership where the student becomes empowered to feed back upon the feedback. So both the staff and the student learn to refine, reshape, and repurpose the aims and outcomes of feedback. So therefore, by discussing how feedback works in an open and inclusive way, what happens then is that students learn to value the process of feedback. And finally, the lighter gray bubble is that feedback can help students mind the gap. And what do I mean there? They can understand where they're at and where they're planning on moving to. So if we don't know where we're going, how do we know we have got to that point? So feedback is often the signpost to say, this is where you are, this is how you can stay on track. So if you think of an image that you're driving a car and you're aiming to get to point A, and you're not quite sure of the route. Previously, we learned how to read maps. Now we listen to a little voice in the car, which is the sat nav. But that sat nav is the feedback clue. It's giving us that signposting. It's looking ahead and telling us that we may need to take another turn. We may need to take a different route to actually reach the point where we're planning on going sooner or in a safer way. So if we think of feedback as a sat nav, we're thinking about how we signpost so that students have a very clear route in terms of their future pathway. So if we move on to the next slide now, we can start to join that feedback with how we engage and the strategies for engaging students. And this is really the focus of engaging students on an online climate or platform. So that light bulb flash is really about, do we know the audience? Do we know the students that we are trying to impact? Think about those in your class, those individuals, and how can we ensure that they are engaged? How do we make engagement inclusive? And that takes time. It takes time in us getting to know the students that we're working with. Within a secondary school, that may be an easier task because you may have seen the students over a number of years. In higher learning, that becomes a more difficult task, especially if cohorts are quite large. So how do we look at this? And I'm sure we can all pick out examples from the past year when we have tried to influence engagement online. We cannot see the class. We see their names on screen. We're not sure if they're there or not. And they are all on mute. So we are speaking to a muted world, and then students become either shy, embarrassed to unmute and speak. So the question is, how do we change that to impact in a better way, a positive way, so students feel safe online? And the way forward is that we need to start out by presenting our best selves online. Talk about how we feel, the challenges that we face, that we're entering a new normal, but together, and that's important, the union between student and staff, together we're exploring new ways of working, different ways of working, going back to that autonomous learner, learning how to own and control and shape our futures in terms of our learning journeys. How do we use the technology that we have to our advantages? And there's many more platforms that are being shaped and improved upon. So online, we can have quizzes, we can have breakout rooms, we can have multiple little groups or smaller groups where students may actually feel that they could learn in a smaller group and then report back to a bigger group. So the online world is really an extension of the physical space, but it's really about how we inhabit and how we reshape the space in learning. What makes or what creates that safe space where students and staff feel safer and at ease in terms of sharing. Find out what inspires the students. So what I often do in my classes, and I hope we can all see on that, I have a coin and I try to explain. I'm trying to get my way aligned, sorry, but there you can see the coin, and we grab the coin and it vanishes. And the question is not what is seen, which is important, but do we see the unseen? Has that penny dropped? Are we taking active interest in getting to know the students we teach and thinking about what inspires them? What could we use online that could be a break in the learning, but actually fine-tune the way in which you learn? Can we help students set real goals about the online learning? What are they wanting to achieve? So instead of thinking of learning outcomes, What I have done is repackage that into learner-centered outcomes. So do I have individual goals for each learner that they can work on and achieve? Let's keep it going. Interactive. What happens when we have those pockets of silence? Silence is a powerful space if it's controlled in the right way, if it's a reflective learning space. But if there's a lot of silence, maybe there's a break-in task. What could we do that may be useful? Invite students' comments. What would they like to do more of online? What do they feel they would like to explore more of, and build that in? We could then look at the breakout and make sure that the learning online is a manageable chunk. So it's a question of how long does learning unfold for? How long do we need? And how long do students need? And maybe smaller bites where students feel, well, it's not going to be an hour, it's only going to be a short pocket. It's exciting, it's inspired, I want to be on there. So it's almost changing their culture. I want to be online, I want to engage, I want to learn. And that comes with playing around with the furniture for online learning. Make sure that your students feel valued. So when they do unmute and they speak, that we recognize that that is brave to actually do it online, just like it would be brave in a classroom. But it's more about how do we recognize that? So we may say that's a really good point because you were able to join these two thoughts, or you combined a critical view on that. So students have an understanding of why we feel that they are valued. So it's not just, that's great, thank you. It's good because you were able, so it's finished in a sense. It gives the student a prompt that they can work upon. I'm doing that skill well. Be patient, very important. Some students may take time to master the new tech, but it is important, and that we recognize that. And a lot of staff may actually take time to look at that. And be clear about the etiquette online. What should students do? What happens if the IT fails? What could they do that they don't miss out? And what I often do is record the class so that they could go back and watch it should they have issues with IT. And then use the chat, maybe pose a question, give them time to think, give them time to write an answer, try and explore multiple ways in which they could engage online. So if they're not that willing to speak, they still have a voice, and we recognize and value that voice, but their thoughts are contained in writing. So the key thought here, know your students and build the online platform to inspire and encourage them to be active and proactive in terms of building their learning. The next slide, we explore this a little bit further. So the journey is about life journeys, educational learning, lifelong learning. We signpost the route, as I said. Are we able to shape the learnscape? And what does that learnscape mean? The learning landscape. Do we know how to help students get from point A to point B? And is it quite clear that we understand where our students are moving to? So on the next slide, we will look at a few ideas. So when I can't find my answers in science, and that is research and teaching and learning science, I tend to turn to song. And one of the most empowering lines that I've come across comes from The Sound of Music and the song Do A Dear. And as you can see in the photograph there, these lyrics, when you know the notes to sing, you can sing most anything. So once students understand how to build their notes, in other words, the greatest skill that a teacher could engage with is teaching or showing and demonstrating to students how they can orchestrate and arrange their notes. In other words, learning how to learn. Because once they are able to build their learning, they can reformat it, reshape it, be creative, and feel empowered by owning their learning. So I think the greatest challenge in moving from secondary school to higher learning or further learning is being able to orchestrate and rearrange notes so that learning becomes impactful and meaningful. Moving on to the next slide. Let's look now at some software. So Turnitin is a platform that I have used multiple times, and I'm really passionate about the use of this software. Some schools are still learning about this, but Turnitin typically is seen as a platform where students hand in their work. They turn it in, and then they get their grade, or it tells them how much of their work has been copied. And that's not the aim of this. There is so many hidden gems contained within the software. So things like, how do we use the Turnitin features to prepare students for lifelong learning? So going back to that journey. So I've coined a phrase called pre-per-goggies. So preparing through a pedagogical approach. So how do we use this to enable the learning? So within the written work or any work that is uploaded to the platform, the tutor or staff that is grading the work can use what we call the quick mark sets. Now, there are pre-created ones where you can simply just embed comments that help students understand where their work is good, but equally areas that they could improve upon. But what we've been doing of late is creating our own, and Turnitin has that software feature where academics or the staff can create their own quick mark sets. And what you may find that there are pertinent or relevant quick mark phrases that may be useful for a particular piece of work. And that doesn't need to just be a written word. You can insert or embed links to videos, to online learning tools that students can actually sense that this is a journey, and that by creating that feedback, students can then feel empowered. So if staff don't want to spend a lot of time writing about things, they could signpost what is good, but in the same time, insert a link through the quick mark set to enable students to access different resources to encourage and improve learning. Then what I did, and Turnitin recognized me for this in 2014 at the end of that year, was to actually use the highlight function as part of the text. In other words, I used to highlight what good writing was, and this was focused on writing skills, in green, areas that needed to improve in yellow, areas that fell short of the standards that we expected in red. So students could have an immediate color coding approach to understand what good writing was. And then with the consent of the student, we then built a bank, a data bank of all good writing. So students could have access to how other students were writing and could then model their work based on different forms of writing. We also use a phrase bank where we can help students with a few prompts and triggers create different strings or starts of words in terms of what is required, for example, in critical writing. And then Turnitin also allows the pair and share, so we can group students to learn with and from peers as well. So this is summed up in a saying that I use over and over again. It's doing things better versus doing better things. It's not only using the platform to help students improve, but Turnitin can help students transform their learning. If we move on to the next slide, please. This is some current work I'm working on, and this is how we move the student from the class to the HE campus. And I'm really focused on how do we prepare students from a holistic point of view. And on that slide, the center of that slide, just under the text that says churning out versus turning into, we've got two bars shaped in a letter T, okay? So we've got the T. So the top bar is the life skill, and the vertical bar, the study skill. So what the life skills are looking at, and I think we've all been exposed to this in the last year, where there's a greater focus on mental health. So really thinking about what do we want our students to be able to do in life? What is the hidden learning that is assumed or presumed or consumed within the study learning? In other words, communication skills, problem-solving skills, empathy, ability to adapt to change, compassion, engaging in civic roles, teamwork. These are the essential skills that higher learning is looking for. We're looking for students to come into a higher learning campus or course and be able to manage and cope with the challenges. So how do we build these skills? On the vertical pole, that could be the topic skills, the academic skills they're studying at school. subject-based, conventions, in other words, ways of working and doing. And for students to really transform and connect their learning from secondary school into higher or further learning, the journey is about how do we balance learning with life skills? How do we align the skills that require them to cope and deal with life? And how do we help students see the unseeing? So this is really the balance game, because the risk is if at school level we only focus on the academic skills, then we are churning students out. It's almost a mechanical effect. Students go through, they pass exams, they do well, but when they come to different challenges in life, their coping skills are lost. So the critical point here is not thinking about churning students out, almost a machine effect, but how do we help to turn students into individuals who can cope with life, who have the skills, who can adapt to change, and that is all informed through the techniques and strategies that we use for engaging as well as for feeding back. If we could move on to the next slide, which looks at the toolkits. So the question that I often ask and that others ask of me is, what would be a useful toolkit to help us navigate these journeys or hurdles? So the way that I look at this is looking at this through a multiple lens. We don't all see the same thing, and it's okay not to see the same thing, but can we understand how students see themselves? So if students can't see themselves becoming, they're never going to be able to achieve the goal of being. So if they can't see themselves becoming a doctor, a lawyer, carpenter, whatever the case is, how do we engage them and help them from a vocational life skill point of view? So we all have a toolkit, a resource kit, but the question is, do we need the tools we have? Can we have multi-use tools? What tools are really effective and useful? So if we move on to the next slide, let's challenge ourselves by asking some critical questions here. So what's in your toolkit? What do you want the student to have in theirs? How do we engage with them? How do we build that? Are students able to use their tools, adapt their tools? What do students need and how can we help them achieve? And we only understand what students need if we ask them, if we understand them, if we go back to understanding who the audience is. How do students need to use the tool? So it's one thing having the tool, quite another thing being able to use a tool. A colleague of mine has just bought the latest toolkit, a proper toolkit, and he's got all these handy tools. He will never use them, but they look nice. And the question is, why do we need clutter? What we need is not clutter in our toolkit, but clarity. We need to make sure that students understand the value and purpose. How adaptable are tools, and how are tools adaptable in terms of those life tools, of the top bar of that T model, communication skill, intelligence skills, skills that really matter when you need to apply your learning in practical or different ways. How do we help students to see things they can't see? And how do we ensure that we are all able to acknowledge what we have in common, but also celebrate and embrace that we have a difference at times? And the tools that we need is to enable students to adapt to change and to consider their journeys ahead. So those are the key questions I'll leave you with, and I'd be happy to explore these further should you wish to discuss these. So on the final slide, you will have my mail address and contact. So if you would like to discuss any of this, I will be online to answer questions. But I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time and listening to this talk. It's really inspiring that I was fortunate to be able to talk to you all and to engage with you in a way that could maybe inspire how we could move our students from secondary school. I wish you the very best of luck, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your time at this show. Thank you.